Between September 2003 and July 2004, a predator stalked the streets of Seoul. Young-chul murdered 20 people in less than a year, becoming one of South Korea's most brutal serial killers. His victims came from opposite ends of society: wealthy elderly individuals in luxury homes and marginalized women working in Seoul's underground sex industry. But this story is about more than just murder. It's about a police force that took credit for work they didn't do, while the real heroes who caught the killer were prosecuted and imprisoned. It's about families destroyed not just by murder, but by cascading tragedies that claimed additional lives through suicide. It's about a justice system that sentenced you to death 20 years ago, yet he remains alive today, living comfortably in prison while his victims' families wait for closure that may never come. And it's about dangerous misconceptions, victim-blaming narratives, and how society fails its most vulnerable members. This is the complete chronicle of how Young-chul became a killer, how he was caught, and why justice remains elusive even today. Young-chul was born on April 18, 1970, in Gacheng, South Korea. He was one of 4 children, including 2 older brothers and a fraternal twin sister. His family lived in extreme poverty, and his father suffered from severe alcoholism, leading to frequent violence and infidelity. The conditions were so dire that his mother considered killing him as a newborn infant due to their desperate financial situation. During his early childhood, Yu's father had abandoned his first wife and was living with another woman. Young Yu spent his early years living with his grandmother in Gacheng, who worked as a shaman. When he turned 6 years old, he was sent to live with his father and stepmother until he completed first grade of elementary school. During this period, both his father and stepmother would beat him regularly, with the violence occurring almost every night. Eventually, Yu moved again and was reunited with his biological mother. This relocation meant he had to enroll in elementary school for a second time, making him 7 years old when he officially started his education. He spent his elementary, middle, and high school years in the Mapo area in Seoul. When he was in first year of middle school, his father died, and he and his siblings finally lived together with their biological mother. She supported the family by working as a nanny, caring for other people's children, and his living conditions improved noticeably compared to his time under his stepmother's care. His elementary school records describe him as a quiet child who seemed mature beyond his years, almost like an old soul. He demonstrated natural talent in both art and sports, and showed a particular interest in animals. He would often tell his friends that he wanted to become a doctor when he grew up. However, there were disturbing signs even then. He had a peculiar fascination with catching frogs, twisting their necks, and dissecting them, which he did regularly and seemed to enjoy. When he entered middle school, he appeared brighter and more adjusted thanks to living with his biological mother. However, his behavior began to deteriorate in other ways. He became known for his fighting abilities and would get into brawls with violent gangs from neighboring high schools. He was appointed as the head of the school's discipline committee, and he took this role to an extreme. If he caught any students smoking, even those older than him, he would force them to kneel before him. His aggressive behavior escalated when he began physically assaulting students who were being scolded by teachers, essentially taking over the teacher's disciplinary role. His criminal behavior started during this period as well. He stole illegal LP records from Soon Shopping Center, and when confronted by friends, he showed no remorse, claiming that since the records were illegal anyway, taking them couldn't be considered theft. This twisted logic would become a pattern in his thinking. Yu had dreams of becoming either a track and field athlete or a professional painter. However, at that time, Korean society did not have a favorable view of track athletes as a career choice. He decided to apply to Anyang Arts High School instead of a sports-focused school. Unfortunately, he was rejected due to color blindness, which devastated him and crushed his artistic ambitions. After failing to gain admission to a regular high school as well, he enrolled at Gukjae Technical High School. He struggled to adapt to the environment there and never fit in. On August 23, 1988, during his second year at the technical high school, Yu was arrested for theft. This was his first serious encounter with the law as a minor. He was sent to a juvenile detention center, and following this incarceration, he dropped out of school entirely, ending his formal education. By 1991, Yu had become what law enforcement would call a petty criminal or habitual offender. He was repeatedly arrested for theft charges and spent multiple stints going in and out of prison. The pattern of criminal behavior, incarceration, release, and reoffending had firmly established itself in his life. Shortly after being released from one of these prison sentences in 1993, Yu married a woman named Wang who worked as a masseuse. However, the marriage was troubled from the start. Just a few months after their wedding, he was arrested once again for theft and sent back to prison, leaving his new wife alone. After his release, the couple had a son in October 1994. At that point, Yu was in his mid-20s and now had responsibilities as a father and head of household. He attempted to maintain legitimate employment by working during the day at a wedding photo studio. However, he continued his criminal activities at night. His nighttime operations involved impersonating police officers and targeting operators of illegal prostitution businesses, extorting money from them by using his fake police identity. During this same period, in November 1994, tragedy struck the family when Yu's second older brother committed suicide by jumping into the Han River. Yu later told reporters about this incident, though the full impact it had on him remains unclear. Throughout his married life, despite having a child and legitimate daytime employment, he continued to frequently visit police stations due to ongoing arrests for impersonating public officials and committing theft. The situation reached a breaking point in March 2000. Yu was arrested on serious charges that went beyond his usual petty crimes. He had been using a forged police identification card to extort money from people, and more disturbingly, he had raped a 15-year-old minor who was working in a red light district. The person who reported him to the authorities was his own wife. She had reached her limit after years of watching her husband fail to fulfill his role as a provider and father while continuing to commit crimes repeatedly. Unable to tolerate the situation any longer, she made the difficult decision to turn him in to the police. Yu was prosecuted for these offenses and received a sentence of 3 years and 6 months in prison. Once his sentence was confirmed and he was officially transferred to prison to begin serving his time, his wife took the next step. In December 2000, just after he was sent away, she filed for divorce. The legal proceedings took time, but the divorce was finalized in May 2002. As part of the divorce settlement, she was granted full custody of their son, and Yu lost all parental rights. He had now lost his wife, his child, and his freedom, sitting in a prison cell with years left to serve on his sentence. This marked the end of Young-chul's attempts at maintaining any semblance of a normal life. By the time he would be released from this prison term, he would be in his early 30s, divorced, estranged from his only child, with no family support, no career prospects, and a lengthy criminal record. The stage was being set for what would come next, though no one could have predicted the horrific turn his criminal behavior would take after his release. Inside prison, something dark was brewing in Yu's mind. After the divorce, he blamed everyone but himself, pointing fingers at society and his wife for his circumstances. His anger grew day by day, festering into something dangerous. His initial plan after release was chillingly simple. He would murder his wife and son. But then something changed his trajectory. He came across an article in a magazine about Young, another criminal. Reading this article sparked a new obsession in his mind. He decided to shift his targets from his family to the wealthy elite of Korean society. On September 11, 2003, Young-chul walked out of prison a free man. He didn't waste a single moment. He went straight to Seoul and immediately began preparing his tools of death. But Yu wasn't careless or impulsive. He understood that murder required practice, so he went to the mountains. There, away from human eyes, he practiced his killing technique by stabbing dogs, perfecting his method. Just 13 days after tasting freedom, on September 24, he was ready to claim his first human victims. He targeted a luxury home in Sinsa, one of Seoul's most affluent neighborhoods in Gangnam. Inside lived a 72-year-old emeritus professor from a prestigious women's university and his 67-year-old wife. Using a blunt object, Yu bludgeoned both of them to death in their own home. The era of Young-chul, the serial killer, had officially begun. Less than 3 weeks later, on October 9, Yu struck again in another area of Seoul. His target was the home of a 61-year-old parking attendant. What happened inside that house was nothing short of a massacre. He murdered 3 members of the family: the attendant's 60-year-old wife, his 85-year-old elderly mother, and their 35-year-old son who lived with a physical disability. The brutality was escalating. Yu struck his victims a total of 34 times with a blunt weapon. When the disabled son came down from the second floor, Yu held a jackknife to his throat and dragged him back upstairs to the hallway. He knocked him down with a hammer blow to the head. But Yu didn't stop there. He continued striking the young man's skull with such ferocity that he died from severe head trauma. This wasn't just murder anymore. This was savage, unrestrained violence. Just 1 week later, on October 16, Yu invaded a 2-story detached house in Gangnam. He attacked a 69-year-old man with his blunt weapon. When the victim's son arrived home, he discovered a horrifying scene. His father was lying on the bathroom floor in a growing pool of blood, barely conscious and moaning weakly. Emergency services rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. He died shortly after arrival. Crime scene investigators made a crucial discovery. Footprints at this scene matched those found at the other murder's location. The media could no longer ignore the pattern. Headlines screamed about a serial killer stalking Seoul streets. The public began to panic, and criticism rained down on police, who seemed unable to catch the killer. Instead of finding the real culprit, investigators were interrogating victim families, grasping at straws while the real killer remained free. On November 18, Yu entered a 2-story house in Seoul. Inside were an 87-year-old homeowner and his 53-year-old housekeeper. Both were killed with the same blunt force trauma that had become Yu's signature. To destroy evidence, he set fire to a safe in the house. In the chaos of violence and flames, a 3-month-old great-grandson lay wrapped in blankets. The infant nearly suffocated from smoke inhalation but miraculously survived, discovered just in time by responding officers. This case, however, would prove to be Yu's first major mistake. Police searching the area discovered something invaluable: a CCTV camera mounted at the entrance of a nearby building. When they reviewed the footage, they finally had something concrete. The tape showed a figure walking away from the scene wearing a jacket that didn't belong to him. Blood had splattered on his own shirt during the attack, so he had stolen a jacket from the victim's closet to cover the evidence. Forensic video analysts at the National Forensic Service studied every frame. They determined the suspect's height was 168 centimeters. Police created detailed wanted flyers describing a male in his 20s to late 30s, 168 centimeters tall, wearing casual shoes. These flyers were distributed across the entire nation. When Young-chul learned that his image had been captured on camera, fear crept into his mind for the first time. The possibility of capture suddenly felt very real. He decided to lay low and temporarily stopped his killing spree. During this cooling-off period in January 2004, Yu tried to live something resembling a normal life. He met a woman who worked at an entertainment establishment and began dating her. He lied about everything, hiding his divorce and pretending to be an unmarried bachelor with career prospects. For a brief moment, he might have imagined a different future. But Young-chul could never escape his true nature. One day he was caught stealing at a sauna. When police took him to the station, his girlfriend discovered the truth. Everything he had told her was a lie: his marital status, his career, his entire fabricated life story. She immediately ended the relationship. For you, this rejection awakened something even darker than before. First, his wife had abandoned him, and now this woman had done the same. In his twisted mind, he wasn't the problem. Society was, and women were. Specifically, women who worked in the sex industry like his ex-girlfriend became objects of his rage. His feelings evolved from mere anger into an all-consuming hatred mixed with a warped sense of victimhood. He made a decision that would seal the fate of 11 more innocent women. He would change his target from wealthy elderly victims to sex workers. His killing spree was about to enter an even more horrifying phase. On April 14, 2004, Young-chul walked through a market. His eyes settled on Mr. An, a 44-year-old man running a street stall. An was selling Viagra and pornographic CDs, trying to make a living like countless other street vendors in Seoul. You watched him from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. When An finished his business and walked toward his Besta van carrying his remaining merchandise, Yu made his move. He approached the vendor with confidence, flashing what appeared to be an official police identification card. It bore the name of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency Commissioner, but it was a complete forgery, created with a computer scanner and color printer. Yu accused An of violating obscenity laws and pharmaceutical regulations. Before An could protest, cold metal handcuffs clicked around both his wrists. Yu forced him into the passenger seat of his own van. At that moment, Yu's plan was relatively simple: rob the man and let him go. But as he drove, something went wrong. An was a street vendor who had been in and out of police stations countless times due to crackdowns. He knew what real police looked like, how they acted, what their credentials looked like. His eyes narrowed as he studied the man beside him. This wasn't a real police officer. The ID was fake. You could see the realization dawning in An's eyes, and panic flooded his own mind. If he let this man go, An would report him immediately. The investigation would intensify. They would connect him to the other murders. They would discover everything. The death penalty would be waiting. In that moment, robbery transformed into something far worse. Young-chul decided Mr. An had to die. Still wearing coating gloves, Yu pulled out his jackknife. He attacked An violently, stabbing him multiple times. An's body went limp, and Yu thought it was over. He tried to position the corpse under the back seat, covering it with clothes. But suddenly the dead man's leg shot out, kicking at Yu in desperate resistance. An was still alive, still fighting. Yu grabbed his jackknife again and continued his attack. Then he reached for his hammer, the same weapon he had used in the wealthy homes. He struck An repeatedly until the man finally stopped moving. This time death was certain, caused by catastrophic head trauma. But now Yu had a new problem. During the attack, he had accidentally cut his own right hand. His blood had dripped into the van, mixing with the victims. DNA evidence. He needed to destroy everything. Yu drove the van back to his office, where he cleaned himself up and changed into fresh clothes. Then he got back into the blood-soaked van and drove through the night. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he arrived at a parking. The lot was filled with oil tanker trucks parked in pairs. Yu had a plan that was as calculating as it was horrific. He parked the van between two tankers, hoping to trigger a chain explosion that would obliterate all evidence. Climbing into the back seat, he prepared his final acts. Yu stared at the handcuffed wrists of his victim. The metal had left clear marks on An's skin during his desperate struggle. These marks could identify how he died, could point investigators towards someone impersonating police. Yu pulled out his jackknife once more. He removed both of the victim's hands to eliminate the handcuff marks. He placed them in a plastic bag. Then he arranged newspapers and clothing over the corpse. Using a lighter from inside the van, he set the materials on fire. Flames quickly spread to the body and throughout the vehicle's interior. Carrying the plastic bag, you walked approximately 300 meters to the Wilmedo area. Near a raw fish restaurant complex, he found a breakwater. He stuffed the bag deep into the cracks between the rocks where it would likely never be found. Returning to his vantage point, he watched the van burn. The vehicle had been parked near oil tankers containing petroleum, and the flames consumed everything. Mr. On's body was completely incinerated, burned so thoroughly that even DNA analysis would prove nearly impossible. Satisfied that he had destroyed all evidence, Young-chul calmly walked away from the scene. The impact of Mr. On's murder rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water, but the ripples turned into tsunamis of grief. On had been the eldest of 4 brothers, the pillar that held his family together. He was the one everyone relied on, the breadwinner, the strong older brother who took care of everyone else. When he vanished, his family frantically searched for him. When they finally learned the truth, when they recovered only a few charred fragments of his remains for burial, something broke inside all of them. The foundation of their family had been ripped away. In November 2004, just 7 months after his brother's murder, the second brother couldn't bear the pain anymore. He took his own life. His girlfriend, devastated by losing the man she loved, followed him into death shortly after, also by suicide. The family was collapsing like dominoes. In July 2005, the youngest brother also committed suicide, unable to live with the trauma and loss. The third brother, now alone, attempted to end his life multiple times. Each time he came close to succeeding. What saved him ultimately was the small dog he had been caring for. Looking into the animal's innocent eyes gave him just enough reason to keep breathing. But his existence became a shadow of life rather than true living. He entered psychiatric treatment and managed to survive day by day. But when word spread that he was the brother of a serial killer victim, his social circle evaporated. Friends disappeared. People avoided him. He fell into complete social isolation, carrying the weight of his family's destruction alone. Meanwhile, Mr. On's wife, unable to face the horror any longer, took her children and vanished. She cut off all contact with everyone, including the third brother. To this day, no one knows where she is or even if she's still alive. One serial killer's decision to murder a street vendor didn't just end one life. It destroyed an entire family, claiming multiple additional lives and shattering others beyond repair. Between March and July 2004, Young-chul's killing entered a new, even more depraved phase. He rented officetals in Seoul. These became his chambers of horror, where he would murder 11 women. His method was disturbingly systematic. He would use his phone to contact phone chat helpers and massage therapists, women working in Seoul's underground sex industry. They would meet him on street corners or at motels, thinking he was just another client. But then Yu would flash his forged police credentials and the handcuffs he had purchased at a market. The women would freeze in fear as he declared they were under arrest for prostitution. He would escort them to his officettle, where they entered willingly, believing they were in police custody and had no choice. Once inside his apartment, Yu's routine never varied. He would instruct the women to take a shower. Perhaps they felt relief, thinking this police officer was being unexpectedly lenient. They would step into the bathroom, water running, letting their guard down. That's when Yu would strike. He would enter the bathroom carrying a hammer. One swift blow to the head, and the women would collapse unconscious. Then, pulling out his Gerber knife, he would kill them. What came next revealed the true depths of his depravity. Young-chul didn't just kill these women. He dismembered each body into multiple pieces right there in the bathroom. In his later confession, he described details so disturbing they shocked even seasoned investigators. He would hang the severed heads to drain blood completely. To mask the sounds, he would turn on the water faucets full blast. And he would play music, specifically Conquest of Paradise by Vangelis, letting the orchestral sounds fill the room while he worked. At first, the process was slow. He used a hacksaw and it took hours to complete. But with each murder, he became more efficient, more skilled. Eventually, he could complete the entire process using only his knife, and the time required dropped dramatically. He was perfecting his technique. Every action you took was calculated to avoid capture. He understood forensic science and DNA evidence, and he planned meticulously to stay ahead of investigators. Of the 11 women he murdered, he had sexual relations with only one. With the other 10, he killed them immediately, avoiding any possibility of leaving DNA evidence. But even with that one woman, he wasn't satisfied. His paranoia drove him further. After killing her, he removed all her fingerprints to eliminate identification. When it came time to dispose of the bodies, his caution continued. He wrapped the dismembered parts in black plastic bags. After burying the body parts in hidden locations, he would return to dig up only the plastic bags themselves. He would retrieve every single bag, leaving the remains in the earth but taking back anything that might carry his fingerprints. His approach to murder was chillingly professional. What set you apart from many serial killers was his efficiency. Most serial killers draw out the experience, feeding off their victims' terror and begging. They want to see the fear in their victims' eyes, hear them plead for mercy, feel the power of controlling life and death. But Yu wasn't interested in that psychological game. He killed quickly, almost businesslike. His victims barely had time to understand what was happening before they died. However, his restraint during the murder itself disappeared completely once his victims were dead. That's when his true depravity emerged. To satisfy his twisted desires, he committed acts of extreme desecration on the corpses. He consumed parts of his victims' bodies, committing cannibalism. He removed internal organs from the bodies. He kept souvenirs from his kills, taking bracelets the women had worn and keeping them as trophies. Forensic profilers who later studied his case identified these behaviors as classic examples of what they call the reliving period. Serial killers often keep mementos or hide bodies in special locations so they can return mentally or physically to the murder. They use these connections to re-experience the pleasure they derived from killing. Yu's pattern fit this profile perfectly. Yu's murders followed the typical cycle of serial killers: kill, cool off, feel the urge return, kill again. Each murder was followed by a cooling off period during which his compulsions would lie dormant. Then, as the depression and restlessness returned, the urge to kill would resurface, and he would hunt again. What investigators noticed was that the intervals between the sex worker murders became progressively shorter. With his wealthy elderly victims, he had taken weeks between attacks. But as he killed more sex workers, the gaps narrowed to days. This acceleration indicated that he was becoming more confident, more skilled, and more addicted to killing. The murders were coming faster because he was getting better at them, and because his psychological need was intensifying. On March 16, a 23-year-old phone chat helper arrived at his office. He didn't use his hammer or knife this time. Instead, he strangled her to death. He took her body to the mountain behind Sagang University and buried her under the trees where hikers passed by, never knowing death lay beneath their feet. Between April and May, an unidentified woman in her 20s or 30s, also a phone chat helper, became his victim. With this murder, he made 2 changes to his method. He began using blunt objects to kill again, returning to the hammer. And he changed his burial location, abandoning the Sagang University area for the mountain near a temple. This new location would become his primary dumping ground. In May, Yu was prowling through a PC room when he noticed a 25-year-old woman. She was sending notes to potential clients, arranging conditional meetings, which was code for prostitution. He approached her with his forged police badge, declaring he was cracking down on illegal prostitution. The terrified woman followed him to his office, believing she was under arrest. She never left alive. On June 2, a 35-year-old phone chat helper knocked on his door. She became another victim. Sometime in June, another phone chat helper, a woman in her late 20s whose identity was never confirmed, died in his bathroom. Her dismembered remains were buried anonymously, and to this day, her family may not know what happened to her. On June 9, a 26-year-old massage therapist arrived for what she thought was an out-call appointment. Instead, she walked into a death trap. On June 18, an unusual twist occurred. You had called a specific woman from an escort service, but a 27-year-old colleague came in her place. Perhaps she was filling in for a friend, or maybe she needed the money more that day. That random decision cost her life. She was murdered simply because she happened to be the one who showed up instead of the woman you originally requested. On June 25, a 28-year-old massage therapist became the next victim. The murders were accelerating now, coming faster and faster as Yu's compulsion grew stronger. On July 2, a 26-year-old massage therapist arrived at his door. When Yu learned her name, something inside him snapped even more than usual. She had the same name as the woman he had dated earlier that year, the girlfriend who had left him when she discovered his lies. This coincidence triggered a special rage in him. He didn't just kill this woman. After her death, he subjected her corpse to extreme abuse, far beyond what he had done to the others. He was punishing her for having the same name as the woman who had rejected him, as if she could somehow pay for his ex-girlfriend's crime of leaving him. On July 9, a 24-year-old massage therapist died in his bathroom. Finally, on July 13, a 27-year-old massage therapist became what would be his last murder victim. In total, 11 women had died in those officetals between March and July. 11 women who were just trying to survive, working in an industry that existed in the shadows. 11 women whose bodies were cut apart and scattered in shallow graves around Seoul. 11 families who would wonder what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. Some of those bodies would be found eventually. Others remain in unmarked graves to this day. When the complete picture finally emerged, the statistics were staggering. From September 2003 to July 2004, Young-chul had murdered 20 people in 16 separate incidents across Seoul. His victims fell into two categories: wealthy elderly individuals in the early phase and sex workers in the later phase. His methods had evolved from relatively crude initial attacks to highly efficient, practiced killings. He had gone from being a petty criminal and thief to one of South Korea's most prolific and brutal serial killers. And throughout this entire spree, he had managed to evade capture, leaving police frustrated and the public terrified. The question everyone would eventually ask was, how did he finally get caught? But before that answer came, 20 families had been destroyed, 20 lives had been stolen, and Seoul lived in fear of a killer who seemed unstoppable. Young-chul's reign of terror came to an end on July 15, 2004, but not in the way most people imagine. The breakthrough didn't come from sophisticated police work or criminal profiling. It came from the desperate actions of massage parlor owners who realized their employees were vanishing into thin air. One owner had noticed a disturbing pattern. Whenever a massage therapist received a call from a particular phone number and went out to meet the client, she simply never came back. The owner reported this suspicious number to police, hoping they would investigate. When officers finally arrested Young-chul, they had no idea they had captured one of South Korea's most prolific serial killers. In their minds, they were dealing with a kidnapper, someone who abducted sex workers and sold them to brothels in rural areas. It was an ugly crime, but relatively common in South Korea's underground economy. The interrogation began routinely enough. Detectives asked Yu what he had done with the massage therapist he had called. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Young-chul looked at his interrogators and calmly stated that he was the perpetrator of the Southwest Seoul serial murder cases that had terrorized the city for nearly a year. The officers must have felt their blood run cold. But then Yu began playing psychological games, acting as if he didn't know specific details about the crimes, creating confusion and doubt. Was he really the killer, or was this a false confession from someone seeking notoriety? He told police he would reveal where he had hidden the bodies, and officers prepared to escort him to the burial sites. As they were leaving the police station, Yu suddenly bolted. He ran through the doors and disappeared into Seoul's crowded streets. For 11 tense hours, a serial killer was on the loose again, and police frantically searched for him. Finally, officers spotted him at a station and took him back into custody. This time, there would be no escape. Back in the interrogation room, Young-chul exercised his legal right to remain silent. He sat across from detectives, staring at them with dead eyes, refusing to speak or cooperate. Hours passed with no progress. Then Chief of Investigation Kim Young-chul arrived. Kim was a senior superintendent with decades of experience, and he had a reputation for getting suspects to talk. When Kim took over the interrogation, something changed in the dynamic. Perhaps it was Kim's approach, or perhaps Yu simply wanted to boast about his crimes. Whatever the reason, Yu began to confess. First, he admitted to 4 murders. Then, as police took him to various locations for crime scene verification, the number climbed higher and higher. Yu eventually claimed he had murdered 26 people. At several burial sites, investigators made a disturbing discovery. Some corpses were missing internal organs. When confronted about these missing organs, Yu made another chilling confession. He had consumed them. He had committed acts of cannibalism. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team and later through the entire nation. However, as the investigation continued, doubts began to emerge about some of Yu's claims. His story about killing 26 people became increasingly questionable. Details didn't match, timelines didn't align, and evidence couldn't be found for several of the claimed murders. Eventually, Yu himself backtracked on the number 26. Investigators concluded that the circumstances simply didn't support such a high victim count. Perhaps Yu had been trying to inflate his notoriety, or perhaps in his twisted mind, he couldn't distinguish between fantasies and actual crimes. The final confirmed count settled at 20 victims, which was still horrifying enough. 20 innocent people whose lives had been brutally stolen by one man's insatiable urge to kill. On August 13, 2004, prosecutors formally indicted Young-chul while he remained in custody. The charges covered 20 murders, systematically committed over nearly a year. However, prosecutors also charged him with one additional case, the Mundong murder. This decision would later prove to be a serious mistake with lasting consequences. The trial moved through the court system with grim efficiency. The evidence against Yu was overwhelming. His confessions, the recovered bodies, forensic evidence linking him to crime scenes. On June 9, 2005, the Supreme Court delivered its final verdict. Young-chul was sentenced to death. In the courtroom, victim families wept with a mixture of relief and continuing grief. Justice had been served, at least on paper. But as the years passed, something strange happened. The death sentence was never carried out. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. 20 years have now passed since that Supreme Court decision, and Young-chul remains alive, sitting in a prison cell on death row. He is classified as an unconvicted death row inmate, his sentence confirmed but never executed. In January 2007, the Ministry of Justice made moves to finally execute Yu's death sentence. The paperwork was prepared, procedures were reviewed, and it seemed the day of execution was approaching. But then the Blue House intervened. South Korea was under the participatory government at the time, an administration that had made human rights its cornerstone value. The Blue House opposed the execution, and the Ministry of Justice backed down. The execution was canceled. This decision ignited fierce public debate about the death penalty in South Korea. Supporters of execution argued that monsters like Young-chul deserved to die for their crimes, that justice demanded it, that victim families deserved closure. Opponents argued that the state should not have the power to take life, that even the worst criminals retained fundamental human rights, that execution was barbaric and belonged to a less civilized era. The debate continues to this day, with Young-chul sitting at the center of it, a living symbol of Korea's conflicted relationship with capital punishment. But the most serious error in Yu's prosecution had nothing to do with the death penalty. It concerned the Mundong murder case. Prosecutors had charged Yu with this killing, along with his other crimes. For Yu himself, this additional charge meant nothing. Whether he was convicted of 20 murders or 21, the sentence would be the same, death. But for the family of the Mundong victim, the stakes were completely different. If Yu was wrongly convicted of killing their loved one, they would spend the rest of their lives believing a lie. They would never know who really murdered their family member. The real killer would remain free, unpunished, perhaps even killing again. Despite having no concrete evidence linking Yu to the Mundong murder, prosecutors pushed forward. They pursued the case through every level of the court system, all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ultimately acquitted Yu of this particular murder, finding insufficient evidence. But the damage had nearly been done, and questions lingered about the real perpetrator. The truth finally emerged in 2006, after Yu's conviction had been finalized. Another serial killer named Jung was in custody for different crimes. During his interrogation, Jung confessed to the Mundong murder. Investigators checked his confession against the evidence, and everything matched. Jung was the real killer, not Young-chul. The victim's family finally knew the truth, but only because of luck in Jung's confession. If prosecutors had successfully convicted Yu of this crime, the truth might never have been discovered. Even before Jung's confession, some experts had expressed doubts about attributing the Mundong murder to Yu. In 2005, criminal profiler Pyo Chang-won published a book called Serial Killers in Korea. Following the police investigation's direction, Pyo initially included the Mundong case among Yu's crimes. However, even in that book, Pyo noted significant concerns. He wrote that there were clear differences in target selection and methods between the Mundong murder and Yu's confirmed killings. The profile didn't quite fit. Of course, when Pyo wrote this, Jung hadn't been caught yet, so he couldn't know the full truth. But his professional instincts told him something was wrong, and he was right. Understanding Yu's victim selection reveals important truths about serial killers and dangerous misconceptions about crime. During police interrogation, Young-chul stated that he primarily targeted women who appeared to be sex workers. This statement created a harmful narrative that spread through Korean society. Many people concluded that women who dressed a certain way or worked in certain industries were somehow inviting violence. But this interpretation fundamentally misunderstands both Yu's motivations and the nature of predatory crime. The reality was much simpler and more calculating. Yu chose sex workers not because of how they looked or dressed, but because they were vulnerable and accessible. He could easily lure them to his home by pretending to be a client. They worked in an illegal industry, which meant they were unlikely to immediately report suspicious situations to police. If they disappeared, investigations would be slower and less thorough than for victims from mainstream society. In truth, most of Yu's victims were simply people who were easy for him to kill, regardless of their wealth, appearance, or occupation. His claim that he targeted women who looked like sex workers was nothing more than a self-serving excuse. It allowed him to moralize his crimes, to pretend he was punishing sin rather than simply murdering vulnerable people. This excuse drew from religious notions he had briefly embraced years earlier, ideas that viewed sexual desire and sex work as sinful. But this was pure rationalization, a psychological trick he played on himself and tried to play on others. Analyzing Yu's evolution as a killer reveals clear differences between his early crimes and later crimes. In the early phase, from September to November 2003, Yu committed home invasions. He would scout wealthy neighborhoods looking for vulnerable targets. He would scale walls or find other ways to enter luxury homes illegally. Once inside, he would attack elderly residents with blunt objects, typically hammers. The violence was brutal and direct, repeated blows to the head until the victims died. He would then search the home for valuables before leaving. This pattern continued through several murders until the incident in Haiguodong in November 2003. That's when everything changed. A CCTV camera captured his back as he walked away from the crime scene. The footage wasn't perfect, it didn't show his face, but it revealed crucial details. Police could see the type of shoes he wore, the style of jacket he had stolen from the victim's closet, the hat on his head, even his approximate height and build. Wanted posters went up across Seoul with detailed descriptions based on this footage. For the first time, Yu felt genuine fear of being caught. He realized he had been careless, that technology was closing in on him. So he changed his methods entirely. The later phase of his killing, from March to July 2004, looked completely different. Instead of invading others' homes, Yu began luring victims to his own residence. He rented officetals in Mapo, anonymous apartments in crowded neighborhoods where no one paid attention to who came and went. He would call massage parlors and outcall services, requesting sex workers be sent to his address. When they arrived, he would show them his forged police credentials and handcuffs. He would claim to be cracking down on prostitution and tell them they were under arrest. The terrified women would comply, following him into his apartment, believing they had no choice. Once inside, Yu's routine was methodical and horrifying. He would order the women to shower, perhaps to remove any forensic evidence from their bodies, or simply as part of his ritual. When they were in the bathroom, vulnerable and unsuspecting, he would strike. One blow from his hammer would knock them unconscious. Then he would kill them with his knife. After they were dead, he would dismember the bodies right there in the bathroom. This new method offered Yu several advantages. He controlled the environment completely since victims came to him. There were no witnesses, no CCTV cameras, no neighbors noticing suspicious activity. The victims were sex workers who might not be immediately missed, whose employers wouldn't quickly contact police. He could force them to call their bosses before dying, creating false alibis where the women claimed they were quitting or had met a good client. But Yu's change in methods was also driven by desperation. After the CCTV incident, he went into hiding, laying low and avoiding new crimes. However, his money ran out. At the same time, his psychological resentment was building. He remained furious at his ex-wife for divorcing him and taking away their son. In January 2004, he had briefly dated another woman who worked at an entertainment establishment. When she discovered his lies and left him, his rage toward women in the sex industry intensified. He blamed them for his problems, saw them as symbols of everything that had gone wrong in his life. In his twisted logic, killing sex workers was both practically advantageous and emotionally satisfying. He could rob them for money while simultaneously punishing them for the crime of reminding him of the women who had rejected him. This combination of practical calculation and psychological dysfunction drove the second phase of his murder spree. The official story of Young-chul's capture is a tale of police triumph and sophisticated criminal profiling. After his arrest, law enforcement officials held press conferences celebrating their investigative work. They described how profiling techniques had helped narrow down the suspect pool. They detailed the forensic evidence that linked crime scenes. They praised the dedication and skill of the officers involved. Promotions were awarded, commendations were given, and the media reported that South Korean police had successfully employed modern investigative methods to catch a serial killer. It was a story of professional competence and technological advancement. There was only one problem with this story: it was largely false. The real heroes who caught Young-chul were not police officers, but massage parlor owners, people working in an illegal industry that society looked down upon. The truth of what happened was far more interesting than the official narrative. Several massage parlor and escort service owners had noticed something terrifying. Women who went out after receiving calls from certain phone numbers were never coming back. At first, each owner thought they were dealing with an isolated problem, maybe a woman who decided to quit without notice or a client who convinced a worker to leave the industry. But as more women vanished, the owners began talking to each other. They held informal meetings, sharing information that police either didn't have or weren't acting on. They compiled a list of suspicious phone numbers. They discovered that different numbers were all connected to the same network of establishments, all ultimately pointing to the same client. The owners made a decision they would catch this person themselves. They carefully coordinated a trap, monitoring for calls from the suspicious numbers. When Young-chul called again, requesting a massage therapist, they were ready. The woman who went out knew she might be walking into danger. The owners followed at a distance, prepared to intervene. When they confirmed Yu's identity and location, they physically captured him themselves. According to reports, they beat him severely before calling police. The mask Yu wore during his arrest photos wasn't for drama. It was to hide the injuries the massage parlor owners had inflicted on his face. Young-chul had thought he was being clever with his phone number strategy. He deliberately avoided calling the same establishment twice, thinking this would prevent anyone from noticing a pattern. Each call went to a different phone number, a different advertised service, appearing to be completely unrelated contacts. What Yu didn't understand was the structure of Seoul's sex industry. Those apparently different phone numbers and services all connected back to the same network of owners. Information flowed between them in ways he never anticipated. His attempt at operational security had failed because he didn't fully understand his victim's world. The owners possessed street-level intelligence that police lacked, and they had stronger motivation to act because these were their employees, their friends, people they cared about who were disappearing. When the truth about who really caught Young-chul began to emerge, it created a scandal within law enforcement. Police had sent exactly one officer, along when the massage parlor owners requested backup for their planned capture. That single officer's presence at the arrest gave police the technical justification to claim they had made the bust. Based on this technicality, the department launched a publicity campaign celebrating their success. They promoted the officers involved in the case. They gave interviews praising their profiling techniques and investigative methods. They held themselves up as examples of modern, professional policing. But investigative journalists and critics began asking questions. The real story leaked out about how the massage parlor owners had actually tracked down and captured Yu themselves. When the full truth became public, it was embarrassing for everyone involved. The officers who had been promoted based on false pretenses faced severe disciplinary action. The department's credibility took a hit. The entire incident became a case study in what not to do when claiming credit for police work. As for the massage parlor owners who had risked their lives to catch a serial killer, their reward was arrest and punishment. 6 months after helping police capture Young-chul, authorities raided their establishments. All of the owners who had participated in catching the killer were arrested for running illegal prostitution businesses. They were prosecuted and convicted. The very people who had done what police failed to do were thrown in jail for their other activities. It was a bitter irony that did not escape public notice. These owners had protected their workers, tracked a serial killer, and helped prevent future murders. But because they operated outside the law in other respects, they received no recognition, no gratitude, only prosecution. This entire story, the incompetent police response, the desperate actions of marginalized business owners, the eventual capture of the killer, became the inspiration for one of South Korea's most acclaimed films. The Chaser, released in 2008, took the core elements of Young-chul's capture and transformed them into a thriller. The film tells the story of a former police detective turned pimp who realizes his call girls are disappearing. When police refuse to take his concerns seriously, he launches his own desperate investigation to find the killer before another woman dies. The movie resonated with Korean audiences partly because many people knew the true story behind it. They knew that real massage parlor owners had caught a real serial killer when real police had failed. The Chaser became both a commercial success and a critical darling, winning numerous awards and establishing director Na Hong-jin's reputation. But beyond its artistic merits, the film served as a cultural acknowledgement of what really happened. It told the truth that official police accounts had tried to obscure, that sometimes the heroes of a story are people society prefers to ignore, and sometimes the criminals in one context are the good guys in another. Even the courtroom couldn't contain Young-chul's violence and defiance. During one trial appearance, he openly declared to the judge that he didn't want to attend court. The judge calmly explained that attendance at trial was not something the defendant could choose. The law required his presence, and his personal preferences were irrelevant. This reasonable explanation sent Yu into a rage. He shouted back, "It's not about thinking or not thinking, I'm telling you I'm not coming." Before anyone could react, Yu launched himself over the defendant's dock and charged directly at the judge. 20 court guards and correctional officers converged on him, physically restraining him and dragging him out of the courtroom. The hammer Yu had used in his crimes was on display in the courtroom as physical evidence. Court staff, stenographers, and spectators evacuated quickly, fearing Yu might grab the weapon. The entire judicial proceeding descended into pandemonium. While sitting in his cell during the trial process, Young-chul began an unexpected correspondence. A reporter from a magazine had written an article about Yu's childhood. Something about her article resonated with Yu, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the attention. For approximately 1 year, letters traveled back and forth between the imprisoned serial killer and the journalist. In 2005, these exchanges were published as a book titled Addicted to Murder. The book was immediately restricted to readers aged 19 and above. The casual way he discussed his murders, the lack of empathy, the twisted logic, it was all too much. Addicted to Murder was banned from sale due to its extreme content. As of 2023, copies trade hands on the rare book market for over 200,000 won. Only 23 libraries across South Korea have copies available for borrowing. Young-chul's arrival at the detention center created immediate tension. He didn't enter his cell quietly. Instead, he surveyed his fellow inmates and made a chilling declaration. "Among you, I will definitely take one organized crime member and one white-collar criminal with me." The meaning was unmistakable. He planned to kill at least 2 more people before his own execution. Prison authorities assigned 4 to 5 guards to watch Yu at all times. They implemented strict separation protocols, preventing interaction between Yu and organized crime inmates. The gang members laughed contemptuously when they heard about Yu's threat. "Who does this guy think he's threatening? We'll teach Young-chul a lesson." Despite security measures, the gang members eventually cornered Yu and delivered a group beating. As the beating continued, Yu screamed, "My only regret is that I didn't kill one of you gangster bastards before I got caught." This revealed an important psychological truth. Yu saw himself as a failure not because he had murdered 20 innocent people, but because he hadn't killed the right victims. The stories of Yu's misconduct in prison are numerous. He attacked and choked a correctional officer, resulting in solitary confinement. In November 2014, investigations revealed Yu had been receiving contraband, Japanese manga, adult magazines, and erotic novels. A correctional officer had been smuggling them in. A National Assembly member suggested the guard hadn't been corrupted by money, but had made a desperate compromise after enduring constant harassment. This incident revealed a deeper truth. Yu had figured out he had nothing left to lose. He was already sentenced to death, the maximum penalty. No matter what he did in prison, his sentence couldn't get any worse. This realization freed him from all constraints. In 2019, the television program, I Want to Know That, revealed disturbing details about Yu's prison behavior. Yu constantly faked illnesses, wasting taxpayer money on unnecessary medical care. He had essentially become the person in charge, living comfortably while guards lived in fear. When chicken was served, Yu would claim the biggest pieces for himself. In the middle of the night, he would bang on his cell door and scream, "Hey, don't you know who I am? It's me, the psycho. Open the door. Even if I kill you, I'm already sentenced to death anyway." He would demand coffee, and guards would actually bring him hot water. Guards became afraid to enter Yu's cell. One prison official described staff members worrying that Yu would bite them or spit on them. Another inmate reported that Yu had once broken a correctional officer's arm. Criminal psychology experts expressed dismay and frustration. Pyo Chang-won stated definitively, Young-chul still feels absolutely no remorse, regret, or repentance whatsoever. After years in prison, Yu remained exactly the same person who had murdered 20 people. Pyo suggested guards needed broader discretionary powers to deal with inmates like Yu. The current system's regulations became weapons in his hands. In 2011, Yu attacked officers again, choking them while screaming, "Don't you know I'm a psycho?" Multiple guards subdued him and dragged him to solitary confinement. After release, he continued his rebellion, pulling wigs off guards' heads and destroying flower beds. However, this reign of terror was mostly limited to Seoul Detention Center. In the mid-2010s, Yu was transferred to Daegu prison. When he tried to behave the same way, Daegu staff followed procedures strictly. They immediately placed him in investigative detention and made him wear protective equipment for extended periods. They didn't care about his reputation or threats. Faced with this approach, Yu discovered his tactics didn't work anymore. Reports indicate his behavior improved significantly under Daegu's stricter regime. For Yu, Daegu was unbearable. He wasn't special there. He was just another prisoner. Rumors circulated that Yu desperately wanted transfer back to Seoul. In 2021, the program Two-Faced reported that Yu had offered Pyo Chang-won a deal. He would reveal additional crimes if transferred back to Seoul Detention Center. This confirmed he had likely committed more murders than the 20 confirmed victims. It showed how much he found Daegu prison unpleasant. The proposal went nowhere. In September 2023, Yu was transferred back to Seoul Detention Center. The Ministry of Justice had inspected execution facilities at 4 institutions. Seoul Detention Center was the only facility with execution equipment actually functional and ready to use. Yu got his wish to return to Seoul, but for ominous reasons, he was being positioned for possible execution. Reports indicate he has been surprisingly well behaved since returning. Not long after initial incarceration, Yu began reporting disturbing experiences. He told staff he couldn't sleep because his victims' ghosts appeared to him every night. "I keep seeing them from the ceiling above the toilet in my cell. About 3 or 4 of them appear as ghosts over and over." For anyone familiar with his crimes, these complaints inspired no sympathy. If the ghosts of his 20 victims wanted to haunt him eternally, denying him peace, that seemed a minor fraction of what he deserved. In an interesting footnote, Yu once commented on the Hwasong serial murders. He said the perpetrator was probably either dead or imprisoned for other crimes. His reasoning, someone like me, a serial killer, can never stop killing. It's not possible, so if he's not killing anymore, he must be dead or in prison. Remarkably, Yu's analysis proved prescient. Years later, DNA technology identified the Hwasong killer, Lee Chun-yi. Just as Yu predicted, Lee was already serving a life sentence for a different murder. One final story captures public anger toward Yu. A YouTuber during his own incarceration encountered an area where Yu had been growing tomato plants. The image was infuriating. A man who brutally murdered 20 people was gardening peacefully. The YouTuber walked over and deliberately stomped on every tomato plant, crushing them into the dirt. He explained simply, "I was furious that a death row inmate was living comfortably enough to grow tomatoes." It was a small act of vigilante justice, symbolically important. Young-chul had destroyed 20 lives completely, torn apart families, created trauma echoing through generations. Someone had destroyed his tomato plants. The disproportion was almost laughable, but in it lay fundamental frustration. There is no punishment that truly fits his crimes. Death is too quick. Life imprisonment allows too much comfort. The legal system has no adequate response to someone like you, Young-chul. So victim families wait, hoping for execution that may never come. The public watches, frustrated that he continues to breathe while his victims don't. And Yu sits in Seoul Detention Center, 20 years after conviction, neither executed nor reformed, a permanent reminder of evil that society can confine but never truly defeat.